The whistle of the afternoon train pierced the dusty air of Taylorsville, Arizona territory, as Eliza Vaughn gripped her worn leather valise with white knuckles. Her heart hammered against her corseted chest like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. This was the moment she'd both longed for and dreaded, the beginning of her new life, or perhaps the end of her carefully constructed escape. The year was 1883, and Taylorsville was nothing like the bustling streets of Chicago she'd fled. As the train shuddered to a halt, belching steam and coal smoke, Eliza adjusted her modest blue traveling dress and straightened her hat. The letter from Nathan Owens was folded in her pocket, its edges soft from countless readings. A husband she'd never met awaited her, expecting a simple schoolteacher with a spotless reputation, not a woman running from a scandal that would destroy her if discovered. Passengers began to disembark around her, but Eliza remained frozen, her thoughts racing. She'd changed her name, fabricated a background, and traveled nearly 1,000 miles to escape her past. What if she couldn't maintain the charade? What if someone from Chicago had connections here? Last stop, Taylorsville, the conductor called, jarring her from her thoughts. Taking a deep breath, Eliza descended the steps onto the wooden platform. The late September sun beat down mercilessly on the small station, which consisted of little more than a ticket office, a water tower, and a few benches. Dust swirled around her ankles as she searched the small crowd for the man whose description she'd memorized, tall with sandy brown hair and blue eyes. Instead, her gaze landed on a rugged-looking man leaning against a post, his face partially obscured by the brim of a well-worn Stetson. He stood straight when he noticed her, and Eliza felt her breath catch. This man was nothing like the gentle-faced schoolteacher she'd imagined based on their correspondence. His broad shoulders strained against a simple cotton shirt, and his face was tanned and weathered from years under the sun. A gun belt hung low on his hips, not unusual in these parts, but still jarring to her Eastern sensibilities. He moved toward her with the easy grace of someone who spent his life on horseback. When he tipped his hat back, revealing striking blue eyes that assessed her with undisguised curiosity, she knew without a doubt this was Nathan Owens. "Miss Vaughn?" he asked, his voice deeper than she'd imagined, with the slight drawl of someone born and raised in the territory. Eliza nodded, suddenly unable to speak. "Nathan Owens," he confirmed, extending a calloused hand, "though most folks just call me Nate." "Eliza Vaughn," she managed, placing her gloved hand in his. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Owens." His lips quirked upward. "Reckon we can dispense with formalities, considering." He glanced down at her small valise. "That all you brought with you?" "I travel light," she replied, the practiced lie falling easily from her lips. In truth, she'd sold nearly everything she owned to pay for her journey, and the false identity papers tucked securely in her valise. Nate nodded, taking the bag from her. "Well then, Mrs. Owens, shall we head home?" Eliza's heart stuttered at his words. We haven't yet. The ceremony. Reverend Wilson is waiting at the church," Nate explained, guiding her through the station with a gentle hand at her elbow. "Unless you'd prefer to rest first. Journey must have been exhausting." The unexpected consideration in his voice caught her off guard. "No, that won't be necessary. I'd prefer to honor our agreement promptly." Something flickered in Nate's eyes, relief perhaps, or approval. "Good. Got a wagon waiting." As they stepped from the station into the main street of Taylorsville, Eliza took in her new home. A single dusty street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, saloon, bank, and what appeared to be a small hotel. People moved about their business, some pausing to cast curious glances at the newcomer walking alongside Nate Owens. "Not much to look at compared to Chicago," Nate commented, helping her into a modest wagon hitched to two sturdy-looking horses. "But it's growing. Got about 500 souls now and more coming with the copper mines expanding south of here. It's charming," Eliza offered, arranging her skirts on the wooden seat. The truth was, the town's remoteness was precisely what she'd hoped for, a place where Chicago gossip wouldn't follow. Nate climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a gentle click of his tongue, set the horses in motion. "Town's about 4 years old. I came here when it was nothing but a trading post. Built my ranch about 5 miles out, good water, decent grazing. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's mine." There was quiet pride in his voice, and Eliza found herself studying his profile. His nose had been broken at some point, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, partially hidden by several days' worth of stubble. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the men she'd known in Chicago, but there was something arresting about his features, a strength and directness that made it difficult to look away. "Your letters didn't mention you were a rancher," she said carefully. "I was under the impression you worked in town." Nate glanced at her, a slight furrow between his brows. "Got interests in town. Part owner of the livery, and I handle some freight contracts, but I'm a cattleman first and foremost. Mentioned that in my second letter, had he?" Eliza searched her memory, but the weeks of planning her escape, the frantic correspondence with potential husbands across several Western territories, it had all become a blur. She'd chosen Nathan Owens because his letters had seemed straightforward, his requirements simple. A wife who could cook, keep house, and perhaps teach any children they might have. He'd asked few questions about her past, which had been ideal for her purposes. "Of course," she lied smoothly. "I remember now. The journey must have addled my thoughts." The church was a small, white-painted building with a modest steeple. As Nate helped her down from the wagon, his hands firm on her waist, Eliza felt a flutter of panic. She was about to legally bind herself to this stranger, this cowboy whose life was so foreign to everything she knew. "Having second thoughts?" Nate asked quietly, his blue eyes searching her face. Eliza straightened her spine. "No, are you?" A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "No, madam." The ceremony was brief and perfunctory. Reverend Wilson, a kindly older man with spectacles perched on his nose, seemed pleased to be performing the service. The only witnesses were the Reverend's wife, a plump, cheerful woman named Martha, and a tall, lanky man Nate introduced as his foreman, Samuel Jenkins. "Do you, Nathan James Owens, take Elizabeth Ann Vaughn to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the Reverend intoned. Eliza tensed at the use of her full name, the name she'd given in her letters, though she'd always gone by Eliza. Another small deception, though hardly the most significant. "I do," Nate replied, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Elizabeth Ann Vaughn, take Nathan James Owens to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eliza met Nate's gaze. This was at the point of no return. A new name, a new life, safety from the scandal that had threatened to destroy her in Chicago. "I do," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Wilson declared. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Owens." Eliza hadn't considered this part. The practical exchange of vows was one thing, but a kiss, even one as ceremonial as this, felt unexpectedly intimate. Nate seemed to sense her hesitation. His kiss was gentle and brief, just a warm press of lips against hers, but it sent an unexpected jolt through her body. His eyes, when he pulled back, held a question she couldn't quite interpret. "Congratulations," Martha Wilson gushed, embracing Eliza as though they were old friends rather than strangers. We've all been so curious about Nate's mail-order bride. You must join us for Sunday supper soon." "Thank you," Eliza murmured, unused to such immediate acceptance. After signing the marriage certificate and accepting congratulations, they returned to the wagon. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. "Thought we might stop at the Mercantile before heading to the ranch," Nate said as they drove down the main street. "Get anything you might need." The Mercantile was larger than Eliza had expected, with goods ranging from tools and farm equipment to fabrics and household items. The proprietor, a middle-aged man named Henry Sullivan, greeted Nate warmly before turning curious eyes on Eliza. "So this is the bride. Welcome to Taylorsville, Mrs. Owens." Mrs. Owens. The name felt foreign, like a coat that didn't quite fit, but Eliza smiled politely and thanked him. "Get whatever you need," Nate told her, gesturing to the store. "No need to be frugal." Eliza selected practical items: sturdy work dresses, undergarments, toiletries. She had no idea what awaited her at Nate's ranch, but she suspected her Chicago wardrobe would be ill-suited to ranch life. As Nate settled their bill, the door opened, and a striking woman in an expensive-looking dress entered. She stopped short at the sight of them, her gaze sharpening. "Nathan," she said, her voice honey-sweet with an undercurrent Eliza couldn't quite identify. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten all about town." "Victoria," Nate nodded, his expression carefully neutral, "been busy with the spring calves." The woman's gaze shifted to Eliza, assessing her with cool precision. "And this must be your mail-order bride." The slight pause before mail-order bride made it sound like something distasteful. Eliza lifted her chin slightly. "Eliza, this is Victoria Palmer. Her father owns the bank," Nate said. "Victoria, my wife, Eliza." "How enterprising of you," Victoria said with a thin smile. "I do hope you'll find our little community to your liking, Mrs. Owens. It must be quite an adjustment from wherever you came from." "Chicago," Eliza supplied, maintaining her composure. "And I'm sure I'll adapt quickly. Nathan has spoken so warmly of Taylorsville and its people." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure he has. Well, I won't keep you from your homemaking." With a rustle of silk skirts, she moved toward the fabric counter. Outside, as Nate loaded their purchases into the wagon, Eliza couldn't help asking, "You and Miss Palmer seemed well acquainted." Nate's hand stilled momentarily before resuming their task. "Small town. Everyone knows everyone," she seemed, surprised by my presence. Nate sighed, turning to face her. "Victoria's father wanted me to marry her, join our lands. I wasn't interested." "I see," Eliza said, though she wasn't sure she did. Victoria Palmer was beautiful, clearly wealthy, and already established in the community. Why would Nate choose an unknown bride from across the country instead? As they drove out of town, the landscape opened up into rolling grasslands dotted with mesquite and scrub oak. In the distance, mountains rose against the darkening sky. It was a stark, wild beauty unlike anything Eliza had known in the East. "Your land?" she asked as they passed through a simple wooden gate marked with a circle with a diagonal slash through it. "Circle/ranch," Nate confirmed. "Goes from that ridge to the creek, and south about 4 miles. Not the biggest spread, but good land." As they crested a small rise, the ranch house came into view. It was larger than Eliza had expected, a 2-story structure built of rough-hewn logs with a generous porch wrapping around the front. Nearby stood a barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was inside. "Home," Nate said simply, but there was unmistakable pride in his voice. As the wagon pulled into the yard, a woman emerged from the house. She was middle-aged with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression as weathered as the land itself. "Mrs. Abernathy," Nate explained as he helped Eliza down. "Housekeeper. Her husband Jeb helps with the ranch. So you've gone and done it, Mrs." Abernathy said, looking Eliza up and down with undisguised curiosity. "Brought home an Eastern wife." "Eliza, this is Margaret Abernathy," Nate said. "She's been keeping me from starving since I built this place." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Abernathy," Eliza said, extending her hand. The older woman regarded her for a moment before taking it. "Got supper waiting. Figure you'd be hungry after your travels." Her tone wasn't exactly warm, but it wasn't hostile either, merely assessing, as though reserving judgment. The interior of the house surprised Eliza. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating the main room. A dining table of polished wood stood to one side, and sturdy, well-made furniture was arranged around the hearth. There were touches of refinement she hadn't expected: shelves lined with books, a decent piano in the corner, oil lamps with etched glass shades. "Bedrooms upstairs," Nate said, carrying her valise. Ours is at the end of the hall. Ours." The simple word carried a weight of implications that suddenly made Eliza's throat go dry. Of course, she'd known marriage meant sharing a bed, but the reality of it now loomed before her. Supper was a quiet affair. Mrs. Abernathy had prepared a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. The food was simple but well made, and Eliza was surprised by her own appetite after the long journey. "Mrs. Abernathy lives in the small cabin behind the orchard with her husband," Nate explained as they ate. "She comes up to cook and clean most days, but she won't be here tomorrow. Thought you might want a day to settle in without observers." The consideration touched her. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful." After the meal, Mrs. Abernathy took her leave, and Eliza found herself alone with her new husband for the first time. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" Nate offered finally. The tour was brief. The downstairs included the main room, a small study with a desk and more bookshelves, and a kitchen with a large cast iron stove, and a pantry well stocked with provisions. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, the master bedroom at the end of the hall, and 3 smaller rooms, all currently empty. "Thought those might be for children someday," Nate said quietly as they passed the empty rooms. "If you're amenable." Eliza nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Children had been part of the agreement, of course. A family was what Nathan Owens had advertised for. But standing here, looking at the empty rooms that might someday hold cribs and toys, made the abstract suddenly, startlingly concrete. The master bedroom was simply furnished with a large bed covered in a hand-stitched quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. A window looked out over the ranch yard, and beyond it the open range. "I'll sleep in my study tonight," Nate said abruptly. "Give you time to adjust." Eliza turned to him in surprise. "That's not necessary. I understand my obligations." Nate's expression hardened slightly. "You're not obligated to anything on your first night in a strange place with a man you just met." His voice softened. "There's time enough for all that. Get some rest, Eliza." After he left, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, emotions swirling. Relief was predominant: relief at having successfully traveled to Arizona, at being married, at having found temporary safety from her Chicago troubles. But there was anxiety, too, about maintaining her facade, about adapting to this new life. And there was something else, something unexpected, a flutter of interest in the man who was now her husband. Nathan Owens was not what she had expected. He was rougher, certainly a true cowboy, not the town-dwelling businessman she'd imagined. But there was an integrity about him, a directness that was refreshing after the duplicitous society she'd fled. As she prepared for bed, Eliza took out the small daguerreotype she kept hidden in a compartment of her valise, a photograph of a young woman with a familiar face, though the hairstyle and clothes were different. She studied it for a long moment before tucking it away again. That woman no longer existed. Now there was only Eliza Vaughn, no, Eliza Owens' mail-order bride, rancher's wife and keeper of secrets. Eliza woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the unfamiliar sounds of a working ranch, the lowing of cattle, the neighing of horses, men's voices calling to each other. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then yesterday's events came flooding back. The train, the wedding, this house her new home. She dressed quickly in one of the practical work dresses she'd purchased at the mercantile. After washing her face and pinning up her hair, she made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, but the smell of coffee guided her to the kitchen. Nate stood at the stove, frying bacon. He'd clearly been up for hours. His hair was damp as though recently washed, and he wore clean work clothes, a blue cotton shirt, denim trousers, and suspenders. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "Hope I didn't wake you. Try to be quiet." "No, the sun did that," Eliza replied, suddenly self-conscious. "I should have been up earlier to make breakfast." Nate shook his head. "No rush. Thought you could use the rest." He gestured to the coffee pot. "Help yourself. Cups in that cupboard." The domesticity of the moment struck Eliza as surreal. 24 hours ago, she'd been on a train, heart pounding with anxiety about her future. Now she was in a ranch house kitchen, getting coffee while her new husband cooked breakfast. "I'm not much of a cook," Nate admitted as he set a plate of bacon, eggs, and biscuits before her. "But I can manage the basics when Mrs. Abernathy's not here." "It looks wonderful," Eliza said, and meant it. The food was simple but plentiful, and she realized she was famished. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Nate spoke again. "Thought I'd show you around the ranch today if you're feeling up to it, give you a better sense of the place." "I'd like that," Eliza said, "and perhaps you could tell me about my duties. I want to be useful." Nate studied her for a moment, those blue eyes disconcertingly direct. "Mrs. Abernathy handles most of the heavy cleaning, but she'd welcome help with cooking and laundry. Beyond that," he shrugged, "ranch takes care of itself. House is yours to run as you see fit." After breakfast, they rode out in the wagon, Nate pointing out features of the ranch, the creek that provided water year-round, the best grazing lands, the small apple orchard Mrs. Abernathy tended, the vegetable garden that supplied the kitchen. The Circle/Slash ran about 300 head of cattle, Nate explained. Not the largest operation in the territory, but respectable. He employed 4 full-time hands, plus the Abernathys, and hired additional help during roundups and brandings. "You round up wild cattle?" Eliza asked, remembering stories she'd read about the West. Nate smiled. "Not anymore. Those days are mostly gone. We breed our stock now, select for traits we want. Better beef, more docile temperament." As they passed a particularly lush meadow, Nate stopped the wagon. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," he said quietly. "Especially in spring when the wildflowers bloom." Even now, in early autumn, Eliza could see why he loved it. The meadow stretched to a line of cottonwoods that marked the creek, and beyond them, the mountains rose in purple majesty against the sky. It was peaceful, beautiful in a wild, untamed way that spoke to something deep within her. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Nate glanced at her. "Different from Chicago, I imagine." "Very different," Eliza agreed, "but beautiful in its own way." As they continued their tour, they passed a small cemetery enclosed by a wrought iron fence. 3 graves were visible, each marked with a simple wooden cross. "My parents and younger brother," Nate explained, following her gaze. "Influenza took them all in '75. Pa had just started the ranch. I was 20, fresh from fighting Apaches with the cavalry, came home to bury them and took over the place." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. "That must have been very difficult." Nate's expression was distant. "It was. Ranch was barely surviving then. Took years to build it up." He looked at her. "What about your family? Your letters didn't mention much." Eliza had prepared for this question, of course. Her false history was well rehearsed. "My parents died when I was 16. Father was a lawyer. I lived with my aunt until I became a teacher. When she passed last year, there was nothing keeping me in Chicago." It wasn't entirely a lie. Her father had been a lawyer, and he had died though when she was 12, not 16. But the rest was fabrication, designed to explain her lack of family connections without raising suspicion. Nate seemed to accept her story without question. "Well, you have a home now, and family, such as it is." By the time they returned to the house, the sun was high. Eliza insisted on making lunch, though her culinary skills were limited. Nate ate the slightly burnt biscuits and overly salty soup without complaint, which she found oddly endearing. After the meal, Nate excused himself to attend to ranch business, leaving Eliza alone to explore the house more thoroughly. She was pleased to discover a decent library and Nate study classics like Dickens and Shakespeare, along with practical books on ranching, animal husbandry, and Arizona Territory law. There were even a few volumes of poetry, their spines cracked from frequent reading. She ran her fingers along the books, wondering what they revealed about the man she'd married. Nathan Owens was clearly more educated than his rough exterior might suggest. Another surprising layer to the cowboy who'd called her wife after knowing her for all of 5 minutes. As she continued exploring, Eliza found a photograph on the desk, a family portrait showing a stern-faced man with a beard, a gentle-looking woman, and 2 boys. The older boy, perhaps 15, was unmistakably a young Nathan. The resemblance to the younger boy was striking brothers, clearly, though the younger one had never had the chance to grow to manhood. That was taken about a year before they died. Eliza startled, nearly dropping the frame. Nate stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry." "Nothing to apologize for," Nate said, entering the room. "It's your home now, too." He took the photograph from her, studying it for a moment before setting it back on the desk. "Daniel was 12 when the influenza took him. Smart kid. Would have made a fine doctor if he'd lived." "And your parents?" Eliza asked gently. "Pa was hard but fair. Fought for the Union, came west after the war. Ma was." He smiled slightly. "She was the heart of this place. Planted the orchard, insisted on the piano even though it cost a fortune to haul it out here. Said a house needed music to be a home." "Do you play?" Eliza asked, curious. Nate shook his head. "Ma tried to teach me, but I never had the patience. Do you?" "Yes," Eliza admitted. "Though I haven't practiced in some time. You should play sometime. Piano's just gathering dust." The conversation shifted to practicalities: the running of the house, the weekly schedule, when supplies were delivered from town. Nate was surprisingly knowledgeable about household matters, though he admitted Mrs. Abernathy handled most of it. "She'll show you the ropes," he assured her. "Don't worry if things take time to learn. No one expects you to know everything at once." His consideration continued to surprise her. The men of her acquaintance in Chicago had rarely given thought to household matters, considering them entirely women's domain. Yet here was this cowboy, discussing laundry soap and baking supplies as comfortably as cattle breeding. As evening approached, Mrs. Abernathy returned to prepare dinner. The older woman was still reserved, but seemed marginally more approving after inspecting the kitchen and finding Eliza had made an effort to tidy it after lunch. "At least you're not afraid of work," she commented, which Eliza took as a compliment. Dinner was roast beef with potatoes and carrots from the garden, followed by a peach cobbler that melted in Eliza's mouth. After the meal, Mrs. Abernathy took her leave, and once again, Eliza found herself alone with Nate. "Would you like to sit on the porch?" he suggested. Evenings are usually pleasant this time of year. The porch faced west, providing a spectacular view of the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. Nate brought out 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to Eliza. She hesitated. Ladies in Chicago society didn't typically drink spirits but then accepted. This wasn't Chicago after all. The whiskey burned pleasantly as she sipped it, warming her from within. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon and the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "It's beautiful here," Eliza said quietly. "Peaceful." Nate nodded. "That's why I stay. Could have sold out when Victoria's father made his offer, bought something in town. But this land," he gestured toward the open range, "gets in your blood." "How long have you known Victoria?" Eliza asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Nate took a sip of his whiskey before answering. "Her family moved here when the town was founded. Her father saw opportunity in a growing cattle territory, started the bank, began buying up land, offered to make me a partner in his enterprises if I married Victoria. But you declined." "She's a fine woman," Nate said carefully. "Beautiful, educated. But she wants a life in town, society dinners, eventually a house in San Francisco or back east." He looked out at the darkening range. "I belong here." "So you advertised for a wife instead," Eliza said, trying to keep her tone neutral. Nate turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "I advertised for a partner, someone willing to share this life, not change it, someone practical." "And is that what you got?" Eliza couldn't help asking. Nate studied her for a long moment. "I think so. But time will tell, won't it?" That night when they retired, Nate again offered to sleep in his study. This time, Eliza refused. "We're married," she said firmly. "This arrangement was clear from the beginning." Nate regarded her carefully. "Are you sure?" She nodded, though her heart was racing. "I am." Their first time together was awkward but gentle. Nate was considerate, patient with her inexperience. When it was over, he held her close, his heartbeat steady against her cheek. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning, a foundation that might someday support something deeper. In the days that followed, Eliza threw herself into learning her new role. Mrs. Abernathy, while never effusive, proved a patient teacher. She showed Eliza how to manage the particular quirks of the cast iron stove, which plants in the garden were ready for harvesting, how to preserve fruits and vegetables for the winter months ahead. Nate was often busy with ranch work, leaving before dawn and returning tired but satisfied in the evening. But he always made time to talk with her over supper, sharing the day's events, asking about hers. Slowly, they were building a rhythm, a partnership of sorts. A week after her arrival, Nate announced they'd been invited to Sunday supper at the Wilsons in town. "We don't have to go if you're not ready," he added. "But folks are curious, and Reverend Wilson's wife is determined to welcome you properly." Eliza hesitated. She'd been avoiding town, fearful of drawing attention. But refusing would only raise questions, and she knew small-town curiosity could quickly turn to suspicion. "I'd be happy to go," she said, forcing a smile. "It's kind of them to invite us." Sunday dawned clear and warm. Eliza dressed with care in her best dress, a modest blue affair with lace at the collar and cuffs. She pinned her hair up neatly and even added a touch of rose water, a small luxury she'd allowed herself at the Mercantile. When she descended the stairs, she found Nate waiting in the main room. He traded his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest. His hair was combed neatly, his face freshly shaved. The transformation was striking. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes warm as they traveled over her. "Thank you," Eliza replied, a flush warming her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." The ride to town was pleasant, the autumn air crisp but not cold. Nate pointed out various landmarks along the way: a neighbor's ranch, a particularly good fishing spot in the creek, the place where stage coaches sometimes stopped to water their horses. Taylorsville was quiet on a Sunday. Most businesses closed for the day of rest. A few people were about, heading to or from church services. They nodded politely as Nate and Eliza passed, curious eyes lingering on the newcomer. The Wilsons lived in a modest house behind the church. Martha Wilson greeted them enthusiastically, ushering them inside where the Reverend and several other guests awaited Henry Sullivan, from the Mercantile, and his wife Mary, Dr. William Thompson, and to Eliza's discomfort, Victoria Palmer and her father, Edmund. "We're so pleased you could join us," Martha gushed, taking Eliza's hand. "It's not often we get new faces in Taylorsville, especially a bride." Dinner was a lively affair, with conversation flowing freely around the table. Eliza spoke when addressed, but otherwise kept quiet, observing the dynamics of this small community. It was clear Nate was respected. Even Edmund Palmer, who regarded him with a certain calculation, deferred to his opinion on matters related to cattle and the territory's future. Victoria, seated across from Eliza, was polite but cool, her comments occasionally barbed with subtle digs. "How are you finding ranch life, Mrs. Owens?" she asked sweetly. "It must be quite an adjustment from city living." "It's different," Eliza acknowledged, "but I'm adapting quickly." "Nathan has been very patient." "Nathan has always been patient," Victoria agreed, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Though I confess I was surprised when he decided on a mail-order bride. It seemed so desperate." Edmund Palmer cleared his throat. "Victoria, mind your manners." "Oh, I meant no offense," Victoria said with a laugh. "It's just unusual in our circle, though I suppose when one lives so far from town, options are limited." Nate's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Martha Wilson jumped in with an offer of more potatoes, deftly changing the subject. After dinner, the men withdrew to the porch for cigars while the women cleared the table. In the kitchen, Eliza found herself working alongside Mary Sullivan, a kindly woman in her 40s. "Don't mind Victoria," Mary said quietly as they washed dishes. She had her sights set on Nate for years. "Her pride's hurt, that's all." "I gathered there was some history there," Eliza replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. Mary nodded. "Edmund Palmer wants the circle slash. It's the only decent piece of land around here he doesn't control or have an interest in. He thought marrying Victoria to Nate would solve that problem. And Nate refused, turned them down flat," Mary confirmed with a touch of approval. "Said he wouldn't be bought and the ranch wasn't for sale at any price." She glanced at Eliza. "Then he sent off for you." "Caused quite a stir, I can tell you." The information gave Eliza a new perspective on her husband. His decision to seek a mail-order bride hadn't just been about practicality or loneliness. It had been an assertion of independence, a refusal to be manipulated. On the ride home, Eliza found herself studying Nate's profile in the fading light. "You never mentioned the Palmers wanted to buy your ranch." Nate glanced at her, then returned his attention to the road. Didn't seem relevant. It might have been, Eliza said carefully. If I'd known I was walking into a situation with pre-existing tensions, Nate sighed. Fair enough. Edmund Palmer has been trying to get his hands on my land for years, first with offers of cash, then with offers of partnership, finally with his daughter. Victoria's not a bad person, but she's her father's daughter. She wants status, wealth, influence. I want. He gestured to the open country around them. This, freedom. And you thought a mail-order bride would secure that freedom? Eliza couldn't help asking. Nate was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, I thought a wife who chose this life willingly might share my vision for it. Someone practical, with no illusions about what ranching entails. Someone who might, in time, come to love the land as I do. His words settled into Eliza's heart with unexpected weight. There was honesty in them, a straightforward declaration of intent that made her acutely aware of her own deceptions. And what about love? She found herself asking. Was that a consideration? Nate's hands tightened on the reins. I hoped it might grow, given time and mutual respect. He glanced at her. What about you? What were you looking for when you answered my advertisement? Safety, Eliza thought. Escape. A place to hide, but she couldn't say that. A fresh start, she said instead, which wasn't entirely untrue. A chance to build something meaningful. Nate nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. Then we're not so different in our aims. As the weeks passed, Eliza settled into a routine. She rose early to prepare breakfast before Nate went out to work, spent her mornings on household tasks, and her afternoons tending the garden or helping Mrs. Abernathy with preserving food for winter. In the evenings, she and Nate would sit on the porch or by the fire, talking about their days, occasionally reading aloud to each other from one of the books in his collection. Their physical relationship developed slowly but steadily, growing more comfortable as they learned each other's bodies and preferences. Eliza found herself increasingly drawn to her husband, not just physically but emotionally. His integrity, his quiet strength, his occasional flashes of dry humor all combined to create a man far more complex and compelling than she had initially realized. But even as she grew closer to Nate, her secret weighed on her. Each letter that arrived from town brought a flutter of anxiety, though none so far had contained anything concerning. Each new person she met prompted a moment of fear. Would they recognize her? Had they connections to Chicago? October passed into November, bringing cooler weather and preparations for winter. Nate and his men worked long hours bringing the cattle down from higher pastures, repairing fences and outbuildings, storing hay for the months ahead. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Nate broached a subject they'd danced around but never directly addressed. Taylorsville needs a schoolteacher, he said, watching her carefully. Town's growing, lots of children with no formal education. Your letters mentioned you taught in Chicago. Eliza's heart skipped. This was dangerous territory. I did, yes, but I assumed you wanted a wife to manage your home, not teach other people's children. I want a partner, Nate corrected gently. If teaching would make you happy, I wouldn't stand in your way. The offer was tempting. Eliza had enjoyed teaching during the brief period she'd worked as a governess in Chicago. But a public position would mean scrutiny, questions about her background, perhaps even inquiries sent back east. That's very considerate, she said carefully. But I'm still adjusting to ranch life, perhaps in the future. Nate nodded, accepting her decision without pressing. Just a thought, no rush. That night, as they lay in bed, Nate pulled her close, his body warm against hers. Are you happy here, Eliza? He asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. Was she happy? She was safe, certainly, comfortable in many ways, but happiness required honesty, a foundation she couldn't claim. "I'm content," she answered truthfully. "This life is good, and you've been more than kind." Nate stroked her hair, his touch gentle. "I want more than contentment for you, for us." His words pierced her heart with unexpected sharpness. She turned in his arms, pressing her lips to his, letting physical connection substitute for the emotional honesty she couldn't give him. Later, as Nate slept beside her, Eliza stared at the ceiling, torn between growing feelings for this man and the knowledge that she was building their relationship on lies. The next morning brought the first snow of the season, a light dusting that transformed the landscape into a glittering wonderland. Eliza stood at the kitchen window, watching as Nate and his men moved about the ranch yard, their breath clouding in the cold air. Mrs. Abernathy entered, stomping snow from her boots. "Winter's coming early this year," she announced, hanging her shawl by the door. "Jeb says it'll be a hard one." "Is the ranch prepared?" Eliza asked, concerned. Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "Nate's a good planner. We've got supplies laid in, plenty of feed for the stock." She gave Eliza an appraising look. "You're settling in well." It wasn't a question, but Eliza answered anyway. "I'm trying to." "Nate seems happier," the older woman continued, moving to the stove to check the bread Eliza had baking. "More at peace. Whatever brought you here, it was good for him." The simple observation stung with its unintended irony. Whatever brought you here. If Mrs. Abernathy knew the truth, she might not be so approving. "I'm glad," Eliza said quietly. "He deserves happiness." Mrs. Abernathy studied her for a moment. "So do you, girl, so do you." That afternoon, as Eliza was organizing the pantry, she heard the sound of horses in the yard. Looking out the window, she saw two riders dismounting, a man and a woman, both bundled against the cold. The woman's face was obscured by a scarf, but something about her posture seemed vaguely familiar. Nate emerged from the barn to greet them, his stance immediately tense. After a brief exchange, he led the visitors toward the house. Eliza quickly smoothed her hair and apron, moving to the main room as the door opened. "Eliza," Nate said, his voice carefully controlled, "these folks are passing through on their way to California. They'll be staying the night." The man was a stranger, mid-40s, well-dressed despite the dust of travel. But as the woman unwound her scarf, Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. Margaret Holloway, a Chicago socialite who had attended the same charity functions, the same social gatherings. A woman who would undoubtedly recognize Elizabeth Vaughn, regardless of her new name or the modest clothes she now wore. "This is Mr. James Richardson and his sister, Mrs. Margaret Blackwell," Nate continued, seemingly unaware of Eliza's distress. "My wife, Eliza." Margaret's eyes widened slightly as she took in Eliza's face, a flash of recognition quickly concealed. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Owens." Eliza forced a smile, her mind racing. "Welcome to our home. You must be tired after your journey." Dinner that evening was an exercise in controlled panic for Eliza. She went through the motions of hostess, serving food, pouring coffee, participating in conversation, all while watching for signs that Margaret was about to expose her. Mr. Richardson dominated the conversation, explaining their journey west to join his brother's shipping business in San Francisco. Margaret said little, though her eyes frequently returned to Eliza with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Blackwell, I understand you're from Chicago," Nate said at one point. "My wife lived there before we married." Margaret smiled politely. "Did you? In which neighborhood, if I may ask?" "Near Lincoln Park," Eliza replied, sticking to her prepared story. "Though I spent much of my time at the school where I taught." How interesting, Margaret murmured. I don't recall meeting you in society there. I moved in modest circles, Eliza said carefully. My position didn't afford many social opportunities. Of course, Margaret said, her tone suggesting she knew otherwise. Chicago society can be quite exclusive. After dinner, Nate excused himself to check on the horses, leaving Eliza alone with their guests. Mr. Richardson soon dozed by the fire, exhausted from their travels. Margaret moved to sit beside Eliza, her voice low. Elizabeth Vaughn, or should I say Elizabeth Caldwell, everyone in Chicago believes you're dead. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest. You're mistaken, she whispered. My name is Eliza Owens. Margaret's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. Please. We may not have been close acquaintances, but I remember the scandal well enough. The young widow who allegedly embezzled funds from her late husband's estate and disappeared when the authorities came calling. She glanced around the modest ranch house. I must say, this is a creative hiding place. What do you want? Eliza asked, her voice barely audible. Want? Margaret seemed genuinely surprised. Nothing, dear. Your secrets are your own, though I wonder if your cowboy husband knows he married a fugitive. Before Eliza could respond, the door opened and Nate returned, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He looked between the women, sensing the tension. Everything all right? Perfectly, Margaret said with a smile. Mrs. Owens was just telling me about adjusting to ranch life. Such a change from the city. Eliza barely slept that night, her mind churning with fear and possibilities. Would Margaret expose her? Would she write to someone in Chicago? How long before Nate discovered the truth? At breakfast, Margaret was coolly polite, giving no indication of their conversation. As the visitors prepared to depart, she took Eliza aside while the men loaded their saddlebags. Your secret is safe with me, Margaret said quietly. We all have pasts we'd rather leave behind. But you should know the charges against you in Chicago were dropped. Your brother-in-law finally confessed to taking the money himself. Eliza stared at her in shock. What? When? About a month after you disappeared. It was in all the papers. Margaret studied her face. You didn't know? No, Eliza whispered. I left immediately after the accusations. I never. She swallowed hard. I'm not a thief. I believed as much, Margaret said with surprising gentleness. Edward Caldwell always struck me as a disreputable sort, even before he accused his brother's widow of theft. She glanced toward the men. Your husband seems a good man. Perhaps he deserves the truth. After their guests departed, Eliza moved through her chores mechanically, her mind wrestling with Margaret's revelation. The charges had been dropped. She wasn't a fugitive anymore. She could have returned to Chicago, reclaimed her life, her reputation. Instead, she was here, living under a false name, married to a man who knew nothing of her true identity or circumstances. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Nate sensed her preoccupation. Something troubling you. Eliza looked into his face, the face that had become dear to her over these weeks, the face of a man who valued honesty above all else. Our guests, she began hesitantly. Mrs. Blackwell recognized me from Chicago. Nate's expression remained neutral. I gathered as much. You both seemed tense. You noticed. I notice everything about you, Eliza. His voice was gentle but serious. Have since the day you stepped off that train. The kindness in his eyes nearly broke her. Nathan, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you from the beginning. She took a deep breath and began her story. Her real name was Elizabeth Caldwell, widow of Thomas Caldwell, a successful Chicago businessman. After Thomas's death, his brother Edward had accused her of embezzling funds from the estate. With no family to support her and Edward's influence ensuring she would find no allies, she had fled. changing her name and answering advertisements for mail-order brides, seeking a place far from Chicago, where no one would look for her. "I'm not a thief," she finished, tears streaming down her face. "But I am a liar. The woman you married doesn't exist." Nate had listened without interruption, his face impassive. Now he rose, moving to the window to stare out at the snowy landscape, his back to her. "Mrs. Blackwell told me the charges were dropped," Eliza continued into the silence. "My brother-in-law confessed. I didn't know. I've been running from nothing." "Why didn't you tell me?" Nate asked finally, his voice low. "In your letters or when we met, why maintain the lie?" "I was afraid," Eliza admitted. "Afraid you'd turn me away, afraid word would get back to Chicago. By the time I learned the truth, we were already married, already building a life. I didn't know how to tell you I'd lied about everything: my name, my past, my reasons for coming here." Nate turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Not everything was a lie." "No," she agreed softly, "not everything." "I need time to think," he said, reaching for his coat. "I'll sleep in the bunkhouse tonight." After he left, Eliza sat by the dying fire, tears falling freely. She had finally told the truth, but it might have cost her everything. The next morning, Nate didn't come to the house for breakfast. Eliza went about her chores mechanically, her heart heavy. When noon passed with no sign of him, she wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and made her way to the barn. She found him there, mending tack, his strong hands working the leather with practiced ease. He looked up as she entered but didn't speak. "I've packed my things," Eliza said quietly. "If you'll take me to town, I can catch the eastbound train." Nate set aside his work, wiping his hands on a rag. "Is that what you want?" "It's what's fair," Eliza replied. "I deceived you. You have every right to end our marriage." "I didn't ask what was fair," Nate said, his voice steady. "I asked what you want." Eliza hesitated, then decided that after all the lies she owed him complete honesty. "I want to stay. Despite how it began, this has become my home. You've become—" She swallowed hard. "You've become dear to me." Nate was silent for a long moment. "I rode out to the meadow last night, the one I showed you that first day. Did a lot of thinking. About truth and lies, beginnings and endings." He stepped closer, his eyes holding hers. "The woman I married might have had a different name, a different past. But her character, her kindness, her strength, her determination, that's been real. Those are the things that matter to me." "You're willing to forgive my deception?" Eliza asked, hardly daring to hope. "I'm willing to start fresh," Nate replied. "Elizabeth Caldwell, Eliza Vaughn, Eliza Owens, whoever you are, you're my wife. I made vows to you and I intend to keep them." He reached out, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "But no more lies between us. From this day forward, complete honesty. Can you promise me that?" "Yes," she whispered. "With all my heart." "Then we have a foundation we can build on," Nate said, pulling her into his arms. "The past is the past. What matters is the future we create together." As spring came to the Circle/Ranch, it brought new life and renewal. The cattle delivered healthy calves. The garden sprouted tender green shoots, and Elizabeth Owens, for she had legally taken that name now, putting the last vestiges of her old identity behind her, discovered she was with child. The news brought joy to the entire household. Nate's quiet pride was evident in the gentle way he now touched her, the protective arm he kept around her waist, the plans he began making for the nursery in one of the empty upstairs rooms. Mrs. Abernathy proved a font of practical advice on pregnancy and childbirth, while Martha Wilson organized a quilting circle to prepare blankets and baby clothes. Even Victoria Palmer, upon hearing the news during one of Eliza's trips to town, offered congratulations that seemed genuinely warm. Time and the knowledge that Eliza truly belonged at the Circle Slash had softened the other woman's resentment. "Father's given up his plans for your husband's ranch," Victoria confided during a chance meeting at the Mercantile. "He set his sights on mining interests near Tucson instead. I think we'll be moving there next year." "I hope you find happiness there," Eliza said sincerely. Victoria studied her for a moment. "I think you've found yours here, haven't you?" Eliza smiled, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. "I have." As her pregnancy progressed, Eliza's thoughts often turned to the twisted path that had led her to this life. The accusations, the flight from Chicago, the fear and deception all had brought her to Nate and the Circle Slash. What had begun as desperate escape had transformed into genuine love and belonging. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, their customary end to the day, Nate took her hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his thumb gently stroking her palm, "about names for the baby." "Oh." Eliza leaned against his shoulder, content in his warmth. "If it's a boy, I thought maybe Thomas," he suggested. "After your first husband, he was a part of your life, of what made you who you are. I wouldn't want to erase that." Tears sprang to Eliza's eyes at the unexpected generosity of the gesture. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Nate replied, "just something to consider." Eliza turned to face him, taking in the features that had become so dear to her: the strong jaw, the laugh lines around his eyes, the steady blue gaze that saw her, truly saw her, with all her flaws and strengths. "I love you, Nathan Owens," she said simply. "More than I ever thought possible when I stepped off that train." Nate's smile was slow and warm. "And I love you, Elizabeth Owens, the woman who became my wife, my partner, the mother of my child." He kissed her gently. "The woman who finally brought music back to this house." In September of 1884, exactly 1 year after Eliza had arrived in Taylorsville, their son was born, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Daniel Thomas Owens, honoring both their pasts while celebrating their shared future. As Eliza rocked her son in the nursery that had once been an empty room full of potential, she thought about the mail-order bride with a secret who had stepped off the train, and the cowboy who had called her wife anyway. Their beginning had been built on necessity and deception, but their life together had become something true and beautiful, a love story written across the wild landscape of Arizona, a testament to second chances and the healing power of honesty. Outside the window, the Circle Slash ranch stretched toward the distant mountains, a legacy they would pass to their son and perhaps to other children in years to come. This land, once her hiding place, had become her home. This man, once a stranger, had become her heart. And this life, once a desperate gamble, had become her greatest joy. When Daniel was 3, a daughter joined the family, Martha Owens, named for the two women who had, in different ways, helped bring Eliza to her true home. As the children grew, so did the ranch, prospering under Nate and Eliza's careful stewardship. In time, the story of Elizabeth Caldwell faded like an old photograph, important but no longer defining. What remained was Eliza Owens, rancher's wife, mother, respected member of the Taylorsville community, and eventually, when the need became too great to ignore, the town's school teacher. And every evening, as the sun set over the Circle Slash, Nate and Eliza would sit on their porch, hands entwined, watching their children play in the yard, grateful for the unlikely journey that had brought them together: a mail-order bride with a secret past, and the cowboy who had seen beyond the lies to the woman beneath, the woman who would become his true partner in every sense of the word.